There's a popular saying that home is where the heart is, and for some people, this really does ring true. Home is where the memories are made, and that sentimental attachment is sometimes worth more than money. Here are 15 people who refuse to sell their homes. Number 15. The Nanning Nail House. In recent years, it's become more and more common for local governments in China to purchase large amounts of housing in order to simply knock the homes down and redevelop them. However, there are some homeowners that will resist these calls for eviction. And these homes are widely known by the press as nail houses, due to them stubbornly sticking it out like a nail in an otherwise completely changed area. And as far as nail houses go, the Nanning Nail House is no exception. Now, the village that the house was part of was relocated in the late 1990s, but the owners refused to do so. As such, despite it being a little more than a ramshackle structure with a roof broken tiles, it remains in its location in the middle of a road to this day. Number 14. The Figo House. Portland is a city that is on the rise, and as such, in 2006, Portland State University was looking to build high-rises in order to accommodate its students. However, in 2005, a house on the land that the university was looking to develop on was purchased by Portland attorney Randall Acker, who used the office space for his small legal practice. Now, the house, which Acker named after his dog Figo, soon became the subject of a long legal battle. However, after 2 years of court filings, Acker was able to successfully argue that the city's attempt to take the house by illegal force, known as eminent domain, did not apply in his case. As a result, he was able to keep the house, and the student housing plan that was supposed to take place on his property was subsequently canceled. Number 13. The Nail Tomb. While selling a house to a developer is one thing, selling away a loved one's burial site is a whole other matter. However, those with family members buried at a cemetery in Tianwan, China, were forced to do exactly that in 2012, as they were offered money by the construction firm to essentially relocate their bodies. Yet while most people agreed to do so, one family refused, as despite being offered the equivalent of about $160,000, they wanted to hold out because they believed they deserved more. And while this 10-meter tall burial mound was certainly an eyesore, although we do not know for certain, it is more than likely not that the nail tomb has since been dismantled. Number 12. The Sun Narita Struggle. It goes without saying that airports are pretty big places, and as a result they need a lot of area in order to be built. However, when Tokyo hoped to build an Narita International Airport in 1966, they were met with a lot of resistance from local residents. Yet among them all, current farmer and World War II soldier Koji Kitahara stands apart. That's because despite being pressured by the Japanese government to sell them his land, Kitahara refused and instead chose to keep farming. As a result, Narita International Airport was simply built around his property. And as of 2013, the 91-year-old veteran was still living and working on his land. Number 11. The Shenzhen Building. In 2006, Kai Shuxiang and Zhang Linhao, who were the owners of a 7-story building in Shenzhen, which is located in China's Luohu district, were approached by local developers who wanted to convert the area around their property into a financial center. However, the couple were rather proud of their 10-year-old building, and at first they refused, causing it to stand alone in a massive construction zone. Yet in this case, money did talk, as in 2007 developers made them an offer they couldn't refuse. And although the final amount is unconfirmed, estimates seem to indicate that the land likely sold for the equivalent of over $1 million. Number 10. Edith Mayfield. Nowadays, Seattle is known for being a large city that is the home of soaring skyscrapers, world-class coffee shops, and relocated sports teams. However, back in 1952, it was exceptionally smaller, and it was during this year that Edith Mayfield bought a house for both her and her mother. Yet despite initially buying in what was just a very small suburb, after only a few years, a stone company set up shop close by, and soon enough the area was getting so developed that the two were getting more and more offers for their house. Yet they refused to sell, and this came to a head in the early 2000s when, after rejecting a $1 million offer for the 1,050-square-foot home, a high-rise began to be built around it. It was at this point that Barry Martin, who was the development's construction superintendent, befriended Edith Mayfield, who by this point was in her mid-80s, widowed and disabled. Against all odds, the two formed a friendship, with Edith often asking him to do errands for her to help her around the house. As a result, when she eventually passed away in her home at the age of 86 in 2008, she left the entire house to him. It was at this point that he sold the house for $300,000 to a local businessman in order to pay for his kids' college educations. Yet the businessman soon lost the house to foreclosure, and while the development owners did end up buying it, they have made the decision to not tear it down. Number 9. St. Joseph's Catholic Church. Churches are generally thought of to be sacred, and thus to tear one down wouldn't exactly leave a good taste in the mouth of the majority of parishioners. Such was the case when, in 1944, a company by the name of Josk's Department Store attempted to have the church torn down in order to build a massive superstore. Now, it must be considered that St. Joseph's Catholic Church was no ordinary place of worship. Located in San Antonio, Texas, it had been completed all the way back in 1871 and was made in a Gothic Revival-type style that really set it apart from nearly every other building in the city. As a result, when the vote to tear down the chapel was brought forward to parishioners, they unanimously disagreed, and this called Josk's Department Store to simply build around the chapel, leading to it being surrounded on 3 sides by the store's walls. It was soon given the nickname of St. Josk's and has since received significant media attention. Yet despite its rather precarious position, St. Joseph's still stands to this day. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. The $1 Million Corner. While most of the properties on this list were owned by regular homeowners, the $1 Million Corner stands apart due to it being owned by, well, a millionaire. You see, the land was purchased all the way back in 1900 for $375,000 by a man by the name of Robert H. Smith. Now, it's believed that he bought the land on behalf of Spiegel Cooper, which was a company who believed that they had the largest department store in the world. That's because this property is located directly on the corner of the Macy's department store, located at 14th and 34th Street. And when Macy's tried to purchase the property from Smith, he refused to sell. As a result, in 1901, Macy's simply built their world record-sized store around this corner property. And this led to Smith eventually selling the land to a completely separate company for $1 million in 1911, which at the time was a record in New York for the most expensive price paid for a property. And while Macy's never did end up buying the $1 Million Corner, it still sits there today, and rather ironically, they have now negotiated a lease agreement with the corner property that allowed them to put up a giant Macy's shopping bag that says the world's largest store on top of its roof. Number 7. The Spiegel Halter Clock Shop. We've all had a case of having bad neighbors, but few can claim to be quite as ticked off by them as the clockmakers at the Spiegel Halter Clock Shop. That's because throughout the 1800s and 1900s, the shop had to contend with the department store Wickham's, which was a relatively large company that had set up shop right beside them. Now, the tension first began in 1892, when the Spiegel Halters agreed to move from 75 to 81 Mile End Road in order to accommodate an expansion to the Wickham store. However, in the 1920s, Wickham's planned to tear down their current store and instead create a massive complex. However, this involved buying out the Spiegel Halters, and this time around they refused. As a result, the department store simply built around the clock shop and hoped that they would go out of business before they did, so they could simply buy them out down the line. However, rather ironically, while Wickham's went out of business in the 1960s, the Spiegel Halters held on until 1982, when they too finally closed shop and ultimately got the last laugh. And in a rather amusing twist of events, although the former Spiegel Halters building is now roofless and derelict, it still stands to this day. Number 6. The Austin Spriggs House. While many of the entries on this list weren't exactly given the best offers for their properties, this was not the case for Austin Spriggs of Washington, D.C. You see, Spriggs used to have a small apartment at 433 Massachusetts Avenue, and in 1980 he began to use it as the office for a small architecture firm. However, by 2003, the area had become a hotspot for real estate, and thus despite the office building being valued for just $200,000, Spriggs was offered a staggering $3 million for the property, so that it could be torn down to make way for a new high-rise. However, he chose to forsake this golden offer and instead hold out in the hope of being offered more money. Yet unfortunately for Spriggs, the higher offer never came, and in 2011 he was forced to sell the building for $715,000 because it was going into foreclosure. As a result, despite Spriggs having the opportunity of a lifetime all those years ago, he let it slip right through his fingers. Number 5. Lubaojian. We all have a dream home, and be it a massive mansion or a cottage in the sprawling countryside, at some point in our lives many of us hope to use our savings to make this dream a reality. Such was the case of Lubaojian, a duck farmer by trade. In 2011, Baogan had finished his custom-built house for his wife and 4 relatives, with it having features such as wooden floors, built-in wardrobes, recessed lighting, and large windows with a view over the surrounding countryside. Yet he had only had it for 1 year before officials told him he had to leave in order to make way for a new road development. However, despite the fact that Baogan had spent the equivalent of about $110,000 in 2020 dollars to make the house, he was only offered about $40,000 for it by the government, and thus he promptly turned their offer down. And unfortunately for Baogan, rather than build elsewhere, this just caused the government to build around his home, leaving the house surrounded in a sea of asphalt. This soon caught the attention of the media, and thus reporters from around the world began to characterize the home as a symbol of protest against forced property demolitions. Yet this wasn't exactly the kind of attention that either Baogan or the Chinese Communist Party wanted, so soon after they settled for a marginally higher price of $46,000, with the local government also promising to help cover some expenses and help with some difficulties if Baogan chose to rebuild elsewhere. And while this decision was puzzling to many, Ying Zheyu, who is the Communist Party secretary of Zhajiangjiang village where the Lus lived, said that, quote, "He is not some so-called protester. That is just a name the media gave him. He did not agree to move before, partly because he was not happy with the compensation, but also he didn't realize the road project required him to leave. He thought it was just another property development project and he could still live there. Now he realizes he cannot just stay in the middle of the road, and he does not like being called a protester." Yet despite this explanation, we will really never know for sure whether Baogan was essentially forced by the Chinese government to sell his house, or whether the media firestorm caused him to do so voluntarily. On our end, we think it was probably a mixture of both. Number 4. Wu Ping and Yang Wu. Typically speaking, apartments are worth a pretty penny, and such was the case with a property that was owned by Wu Ping and Yang Wu of Chongqing, China. That's because ever since Ping's father had purchased a plot of land in the area in 1944, the family had, with one short exception, kept ownership of the building, converting its lower level to a popular restaurant while living in the apartment atop of it. Yet in 2004, the government began to relocate residents from the area in order to make way for a shopping mall, and out of the 280 homes in the area, 279 agreed to leave. However, the compensation package offered, which was a choice of either $350,000 or 2 higher floors in a new building, was outrightly rejected by the couple, who claimed that it was well under the actual value of the building. As a result, the couple held out for 3 years, and in that time, the developers not only built a massive construction ditch around the structure, but also cut off its electricity and water supply. As a result, in early 2007, the Chinese government sued in order to forcibly kick them out of the house. But then, something unexpected happened. You see, in February of 2007, the Chinese government had passed a property law that essentially banned forced evictions. Thus, when the media picked up the story in late February of that year, many wanted to see if the communist government would stick true to its new law or go against it. And in a rather atypical fashion, the owners fully took advantage of the media attention, even going so far as to put a Chinese flag on the roof, along with a banner reading, quote, "Citizens, private property rights must not be violated." On March 21st of that year, however, despite the government allowing for all the media attention, and despite the fact that the majority of people in public chat rooms, even within China itself, were supportive of the couple, by April of 2007, the pair had agreed to settle with the government for an undisclosed fee, and on April 2nd, the house was finally demolished. Number 3. Vera King. Atlantic City is well known for its casinos, hotels, and shows, but it wasn't always this way. Vera King knew this all too well, as in 1961, her and her husband bought the property at 127th South Columbia Place as a summertime retreat for $20,000, and soon after it became their bona fide home. Yet as the mega casinos in the city grew, so did the demand for her property. As such, in the late 1970s, Bob Guccione, who was a real estate developer, tried to buy the property for the equivalent of $3.65 million in 2020 dollars. However, King rejected the offer. Then in 1993, Donald Trump tried to entice her into selling the property so he could use it as a parking space for the limos at his Atlantic City casino and hotel. But still, she wouldn't budge. This led to the city trying to evict her from her property via a process known as the power of eminent domain, and in doing so only offered her about a quarter of what Bob Guccione did about 15 years earlier. As a result, she took the city to court, and in 1988 she won. From then on, Koking remained in her house until 2010, when she moved to a retirement home in the San Francisco Bay Area near her daughter and grandchildren, leading to the house being put up for sale. It was eventually bought for $583,000 in an auction on July 31st of 2014 by Carl Icahn, who held the debt on Trump Entertainment and was the owner of Trump Plaza. Yet after making the purchase, he subsequently demolished the home on November the 19th of 2014. Number 2. Michael Forbes. Golf courses are easily one of the most scenic things to have a property close to, and oftentimes they can drive up the prices of homes located nearby. However, they tend to be not so great if someone tears down your property in order to build one. And this was the case with Michael Forbes of Aberdeenshire, Scotland. That's because in 2007, current American President Donald Trump was in the process of building a golf course in the area and hoped to get his hand on Forbes' land. However, after Trump presented an offer of what would today amount to about $750,000, along with an unspecified job at the course at a rate of about $80,000 per year, Forbes flat out refused and instead decided to spray paint 2 massive messages on his farm saying, "No golf course," and "No more Trump lies." As a result, Trump tried to start a massive smear campaign against Forbes.
Mr. Forbes is not a man that people in Scotland should be proud of.
However, this instead backfired when hundreds of people began to spite Trump by buying small shares of Forbes' land in order to make it harder for either the Scottish government or Trump himself to take possession of it. This then began to further escalate, as not only did many of Forbes' neighbors also begin to oppose Trump, but Forbes took it upon himself to get very close with the media to even begin flying a Mexican flag above his farm in protest. Ultimately, however, despite the media outcry and the condemnation of the course both by local officials and environmentalists in the area, the golf course was still built, with said course being opened in 2012. Yet thankfully, Forbes and his neighbors were never evicted from their land, and therefore the course simply had to be built around their property lines. Number 1. The Oka Crisis. While most of the examples on this list were relatively small-scale conflicts between independent property owners and major developers, the Oka crisis was anything but. That's because this was a case where the Canadian government tried to take away land that belonged to the Kanesatake people, who are an indigenous group that live near the town of Oka, which is located near the Canadian city of Montreal. Now, the issue at hand was the developers wanted to expand a 9-hole golf course into an 18-hole golf course with 60 condominiums to the side. However, the land they wished to develop on was a wooded area known as the Pines, which was a place where the Kanesatake would conduct ceremonies, play lacrosse, and even bury their dead. As a result, when the courts ruled in favor of developers in 1990, and the town of Oka tried to have the Kanesatake removed, chaos ensued. That's because in order to stop the development, the Kanesatake not only set up barriers to the Pines that were guarded with armed warriors, but also allied with the nearby Kanawake tribe to block off the Mercier Bridge, which was one of the most vital transportation routes linking Montreal's suburbs to its downtown. This led to the military being called, and rather than side with the Kanesatake, many white Quebecois residents wanted the military to go in and quash the protesters. This all came to a head on July 11th of 1990, when a soldier by the name of Corporal Marcel Lemay was killed in a shootout between the Kanawake and Quebec's provincial police. Yet by September 26 of 1990, the government agreed to some of the Kanesatake's demands, and went ahead and bought the Pines from the developers for a sum of $5.3 million, which would be worth about $9.25 million today. And with this land now firmly in the hands of the Kanesatake, by way of the federal government, this crisis became a shining example of how indigenous people can not only make a stand against governments regarding their property rights, but can actually come out victorious. That's all we have for you today, everyone, and thank you all for watching. Let us know which property dispute you thought was the most interesting. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notifications button so that you never miss out on another one of our videos. Until next time.